Well, thank you, Paige. Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today for our Advanced Concepts webinar. Well, let me tell you why I care about a presentation like this. This is the view out of my bedroom window of the 71-unit condo association where I was president. That's when I got my start in this industry. It was probably my second or third meeting as president, and we were in my living room sitting around the coffee table on the couch and some chairs. The manager looked at me and reported that the living room window of one of the other units was leaking and needed to be replaced. And I remember it was a significant number. I'm thinking it was about $2,600, $2,500, something like that. It was a big number. And he asked, what should I do about that? And I was just floored by the question, and everyone looked at me waiting for a response, and it seemed like I should say, well, pay the bill, but I kind of didn't know why it was even a question, and bottom line was I didn't know what exactly the right answer was. I didn't know what to do. And I'm the kind of person who hates knowing or not knowing what to do. So I'd just taken on this role. And as a competitive person, I like to win. I like to know what's right. I like to do the right thing. And I didn't then and still don't like being lousy at anything. I still remember that awful feeling of not knowing exactly what the right thing was to do. So that's why we're presenting this webinar today. I want to give you the training to minimize or eliminate situations where you don't know what to do. So let's get going on the webinar. As Paige said, everyone's muted to keep background noise to a minimum, but if at any time Kevin or I need your feedback, we'll ask you to raise your hands. And you'll find the hands raised button in your control panel. It'll look something like what you see on screen. So let's test that right now. Give me a hand raised if you're ready for us to get started on the presentation. Hands raised, everyone. I'm looking up and down the list, and I'm seeing hands going up just about everywhere. Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to put hands down. I'm going to lay just a little more foundation before handing off to Kevin, and it all starts with knowing that the major expenses related to age and deterioration are big, they're inevitable, and association finances are always going to be tight. So you're always going to be in a pressure situation. Kevin's going to cover the more advanced material today. So if you feel we've skipped over some of the basics, feel like you're getting left behind, you can catch up with some of our other recorded webinars, and you're going to find those on our website. Go to reservestudy.com, click on our resources tab up at the top, click on webinars. I recommend Reserve Study Basics and a webinar we presented a couple months ago called Roadmap for Success. I hope you joined us for that one. It was a good one. These basic materials we have, plus today's material, are all, again, designed to help you avoid that awful feeling of not knowing what to do. And that's because managing or leading an association is complicated. There's a lot of ways to get it wrong, a lot of decisions that you're going to face throughout the year. So with that kind of setup, let me hand it off to Kevin, who's going to share some truth, some insights, and answers to help you avoid situations where you don't know what to do.
All right. Thanks, Robert. It's great to be here with you today and with all of our guests as well. Now, so sometimes reserve studies can be challenges right from the start. We hear objections like the ones you see on screen all the time. What's it good for? That it's really just a bunch of guesses. Why pay for something we're just going to ignore? I like that one. And how reserve studies can sometimes be so different from year to year, or when one company does it versus another.
Yeah, I like it when they object right to my face, like at a trade show in front of a whole bunch of other people.
Exactly. So let me dive right in. A reserve study is based on predictions about future events over which we have no control. So it's kind of weird to work in a field where I know with 100% certainty that our reserve study projections will not all come true. But think of it like a roadmap or getting directions on your phone. While it may not be perfect, it's a pretty effective tool, and you need help knowing how to get where you want to go. A reserve study also shows you what you need to do to get successfully into the future. A reserve study helps you see the twists and turns along the way, and if it's going to be an easy trip or even if it's going to be a hard one, it's important to know that from the start. So you need that guide to help you with your decision points. We base our reserve studies on a couple of things, on industry standards and actual project history at your association and neighboring properties. So we're assembling the best information available to help you see and anticipate the future before it happens. Now, no one's telling you you have to follow the reserve study, but it's a great guide that lays out your major upcoming expenses, giving you a window to what your association needs to prepare for financially. With a reserve study, you're less likely to be surprised by those big expenses like Robert was talking about earlier. We like it and we enjoy it when our clients are prepared and they know what to expect. So I talked about industry standards, and what I mean by that are National Reserve Study standards. These standards guide our entire industry. They help us use consistent terminology, calculations that give you standard disclosures, even guiding us which components should appear in the reserve study. The more your reserve provider, your reserve study provider, follows national standards, the more accurate and useful the reserve study is going to be.
And the more, or maybe I should say the narrower the differences are between one reserve study provider and another.
Yeah, exactly. So as long as your reserve provider is a credentialed reserve specialist and prepares their reserve studies according to National Reserve Study standards, there should be very little difference between one company or another.
Yeah, got it. Thanks.
As far as their report format.
Right, right.
So let's talk about some specifics. Some of the problems I hear clients getting into are actually avoidable. They make me think of minefields. So let me help you know how to avoid those mines or some of those common problems related to reserves. First of all, don't make any statements you can't support. When it comes to the reserve study, it's much better to say, well, let's look at the reserve study and see what it says, rather than say, oh, the reserves are great. People can and they will misinterpret your well-intended comments. So always go to the source, the reserve study itself. Second, you create your own problems when you're working with old information. It's like trying to make wise financial decisions in October by looking at a February financial report. So it's important to update your reserve study and make sure you're working with fresh and current information. Another avoidable problem is delaying projects. While it often sounds like a good idea, thinking that if you don't spend the money, it's money saved, in most cases, doing the project on time is a good idea and the right thing to do, except for a few cases when the project is insignificant and doesn't matter much. Generally, reserve projects should be done on time because they keep the property well maintained, which avoids expensive deferred maintenance, and it maintains good function and curb appeal, which supports strong property values. As we continue doing projects on time, doing projects on time is something that I'm going to repeat throughout the webinar. I should also note that delaying projects isn't always a bad idea. There are a few situations when it actually makes sense. And you know what, please let us know in the questions or send me an email if you'd like us to do actually an entire webinar about reserve project priorities, different types of component failure, and when it's a good or bad idea to delay projects. But
that's a great point. That's a great point, Kevin, because we do get questions about that, and maybe that's an upcoming webinar that we should try to prepare.
Yeah, that sounds like a plan. But moving on to my next point, which is be careful with your spending. Don't carelessly spend reserve funds on non-reserve projects. Make sure anything you spend reserves on either is listed as a reserve component or passes the National Reserve Study Standard 4-part test. It may seem like no big deal, but a few $100 or $1,000 here or there really adds up over a year and prevents you from having as much in reserves as you were originally planning. And the same is true from the income side. Make sure you're making all your scheduled reserve contributions. You can't spend it on reserve projects if you never put it in the first place, and your reserve plan is based on the association making its scheduled reserve contributions. And finally, we call this the wishful thinking problem. There are too many of my clients thinking there is a magic genie out there capable of fixing their association with 3 wishes. It doesn't happen. Reserve projects are expensive. Sometimes they come in at budget or under budget, but many times and oftentimes they come in over budget. If you're being too optimistic, you don't have a realistic plan and you won't be prepared for your own reality. But for now, let's keep an eye on the big picture. What are we trying to accomplish with reserves? Well, it's about having enough funds on hand to do your scheduled projects in a timely manner when they need to be done. Now, I've been an athlete all my life, playing baseball through college, and now I play a lot of golf. It's no surprise that I like to win. And in baseball and golf, you need to know the rules and the score for you to make good decisions to win the game.
So you keep tracking on the numbers.
Exactly. So how do you win at reserves? Just like most games, the score is based on numbers. You have a plan that's based on income and expenses. So you need to keep the income coming in and keep your expenses from getting out of hand. And there are actually 2 sets of rules that affect reserve studies and reserve fund management. The first is pretty straightforward. It's what we call the 4 reserve rules. It's really just a statement of facts that expenses, like will always happen. There's no dodging them. The board is responsible to manage the assets of the association. Like I mentioned a moment ago, delays often get expensive. So it's good to do your reserve projects on time and not let them get out of hand. And then the owners always get stuck paying the bills. There is no magic genie. Whether the board saves the owner's money, or makes things more expensive, the owners always get stuck paying the bills. Now, the other set of rules is called the business judgment rule. When a board gets into legal hot water and their decisions are challenged, what they've done and the decisions they've made as a board member is checked against the business judgment rule. So when the board is collecting all those reserve contributions and making those large reserve expenses, you'll want them to make sure you're operating in line with the rules. What's interesting is that in hindsight, you can be flat out wrong, but if you can show that you followed the process and had a reasonable basis for that decision, then you'll have a strong defense. So make sure everything you do can be described as being in good faith, meaning you were loyal and responsive to the needs of the association. You operated in the best interests of the association, meaning you didn't do anything wasteful, and you were careful and responsible with association money, and that you acted prudently or responsibly, meaning that when you simply didn't know what to do, you didn't just guess. You reached out to someone, a subject matter expert, for assistance. That's what they're there for. That could be your accountant, attorney, manager, insurance agent, reserve study provider, of course, maybe even the owner of the landscaping company. In other words, there is no guessing. When you don't have all the information or the right answer or don't know what to do, go ahead and ask the expert, get their opinion and recommendation, and then move forward. But there's no reason to guess at this point.
Yeah, reach out when necessary.
And then also, there's something new you should know about, because more and more people will be asking if the association has, quote, adequate reserves. So you need to be careful, because that is now a defined industry term. You can see more on our website, but pretty simply, it means that your reserve plan shows that you'll have enough cash to do all your reserve projects now and for the next 20 years without the reliance on future loans and special assessments. Think sustainability. Again, no wishful thinking or relying on a magic genie, but rather having a successful plan for the future. Now, you may often think or be asked how to responsibly lower your reserve contributions. Well, knowing that you can't change your expenses, the roof is going to fail no matter how hard you wish it to last longer, then you're forced to try to figure out something else. The first step is to maximize the reserve income, which means maximizing your interest. Some of our clients do that by shopping around to different banks. Some of them do that by laddering their investments so they can sock away money, the money that they don't need for a longer period of time, so that it can earn higher interest rates. Another idea is to do your projects on time. I can't tell you how many times a client has delayed a painting or asphalt, roofing, or deck project thinking that they were saving money, only to end up spending way more money, and I'm talking 20 to 40% more, a year or two later due to fixing deferred maintenance.
Yeah, those are big mistakes.
Yeah, so yeah, and in the component list, there's going to be different components that are related to preventative maintenance that absolutely cannot be delayed, because if they do delay the preventative maintenance, then the larger repair and replacement projects are going to come sooner than expected and really put the association in some trouble. So the next point is to simply make your reserve contributions and keep your reserve expenses in check. Associations with a strong reserve fund are just keeping their reserve fund stable. They aren't playing catch up. Generally speaking, associations with a strong reserve fund have lower contributions than those struggling to get over the hurdles that come with a marginal reserve fund. The consequences of underfunding are real. When your reserves are weak, you need to step on the gas and play catch up to make up for all those years of underfunding the reserves. And then there's also ways to save money on your reserve study expenses. The first is to hire us for the right level of service. So if you've had a reserve study prepared responsibly and according to National Reserve Study standards, you don't need another full reserve study. It's time for you to select between less expensive with site visit or no site visit updates. And then you can also improve the quality of your reserve study and stretch the interval between updates by asking questions and making sure the reserve study is really custom tuned to your association. And finally, we also encourage you to be involved in the process. When we find a helpful client that answers our questions about what was done and when, why, and by whom, it reduces the amount of time we spend. And you'll move into a category of a favored client, and we'll be able to charge you less for your reserve study updates.
Yeah, and we love those favored clients that make it easy for us.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're able to make the process easy and smooth for the people working for you, then I'm sure we'll be able to make it beneficial for the association as well. So now you've signed up for advanced concepts, so let's give you a few more. First, interest and inflation are both real and important. They don't cancel each other out, and that's because interest is earned only on the reserve funds you have on deposit, but inflation causes the entire value of all your components to grow. So, for example, if you have $80,000 earning interest in your reserve fund, you might have $800,000 worth of reserve components that are being affected by inflation year after year. So that's why inflation has a much greater influence on the overall long-term funding analysis. I've also talked about the danger of delaying a project once again, and I'm going to emphasize it again here. There really is very little value to delaying a project. The expense is going to still be there whether you do it next year or the year after, and it's going to come out of the reserve fund. Unless you can totally eliminate the expense, which pretty much never happens, delaying a project doesn't have a measurable effect on reducing your reserve contributions. Just, you can trust me on this. It's not worth the headaches of delaying projects. And then also getting all worked up or frustrated about the question of operating or reserves is just not that big of a deal. At the end of the day, it's going to come out of the owner's pocket. A $5,000 pool heater is just as expensive to the owners if it's paid from operating or reserves. We do cover this issue in other webinars, but the bottom line is that there is no effect on the bottom line savings to a homeowner, whether it is paid from their right pocket or their left, operating or reserves. And then by all means, think ahead and take advantage of ways to save money by doing projects together. If you need to paint the trim of the buildings, paint your ironwork at the same time. If you need to seal your asphalt, perhaps paint the red curbs at the same time. If you're replacing furniture in your clubhouse, consider replacing the carpet and repainting the walls also at the same time. If you can combine projects and save the company doing those projects time, then they'll be able to save the association some money as well. A few clients have voiced some concerns that they don't want to inappropriately influence the process. They want a good reserve study and don't want to influence the outcome. No worries on that. I've done 1,000 of these. The other reserve specialists working for Association Reserves have done thousands as well. We know National Reserve Study standards, and at the end of the day, it's our company logo that goes on the cover. We welcome all your suggestions and insights into what happened and when and why. After all, more information will improve the accuracy of the report. But we also know when to put our filter on and keep our independence. Nobody twists our arms. We know when to dig in our heels. Now let me take a moment to go over best practices. Best practices with respect to your reserve funding plan. First, it's in your best interest and you'll have the most success if you characterize reserve contributions as offsetting deterioration. That makes reserve contributions sound like paying an ongoing bill, which is in truth what it is. Just because the roof doesn't send a bill for its deterioration every month doesn't mean it didn't deteriorate. Pay the deterioration bill. Don't say reserve contributions are for the future or for a rainy day. That makes contributions sound kind of optional or someone else's problem. We're going to design a funding plan that is steady and smooth, which is also what's recommended in National Reserve Study standards. As much as possible, we don't want to unsettle your owners with big increases. So we're going to design a smooth funding plan with small annual increases to offset various factors such as inflation, and then it's up to you to get your reserve study updated regularly so that any adjustments that do need to be made are small. And finally, if a big change is necessary, likely we'll create a multi-year plan, something we call the exercise plan. Just like most of us can't go out and run a marathon next week, I know I can't.
I can't.
It takes some time to prepare. An exercise funding plan is a series of increases over the course of about 2 to 5 years to gradually get your contributions from where they are now up to where they need to be. And the last topic I'll cover before Robert begins to wrap things up is helping you understand some of the nuances of what you're getting in the reserve study. So the first one is, how far ahead will we be looking in estimating component expenses? The answer is that at least 20 years of projected income and expenses are required by National Reserve Study standards. Projects within the next 30 years are required by state law here in California. But the real answer is that we want to capture basically all of the significant, reasonably predictable projects that are in your future. We don't want you to be surprised, so we want you to see all these landmines so that you can avoid them and prepare for them financially. So if you just put on a new roof that has a 40-year design life, we're still going to include that in your reserve study, even though it's beyond the 30-year horizon, because it's a major component that eventually will need to be replaced. So even though it's beyond that 30-year horizon, we still want to make sure the association is aware of it and is planning accordingly. I mentioned a few times the importance of updating your reserve study. So What can I tell you to help you make a wise decision about how often to update your reserve study? Before I get into the numbers, I'll tell you what I've kind of experienced during my time working as a reserve specialist. When we only touch a reserve study every 5 years, it's pretty much a rescue mission. So much has changed about components' life and costs and the reserve balance that sometimes it's almost like doing a completely new reserve study. At this point, the association has usually seriously gotten off track. Now, for those who hire us every 3 years, it's pretty reasonable, but we still usually need to make some significant adjustments. And then finally, there are clients that hire us every year. We actually have new software tool that will put more of this power in your hands, but we can go into that another time. But in almost all cases, the reserve studies we update annually are just need minor tweaks. It's just what the board needs. It's very easy on the owners, and the reserve plan just plain never gets off track. So in addition to my impressions, let me give you some numbers. The associations that hire us every 3 years instead of every 5 years have 8.3% fewer special assessments than the 5-year group. And that's simply because they've limited their drifting away from the original plan to just 3 years instead of getting 5 years off of the original plan. And then let me wrap up my portion of the presentation with this one. Here's a huge benefit that will help you decide how often to update your reserve study. Associations that update their reserve study annually have just over 35% fewer special assessments than the 5-year group. And again, that's just because they are staying on top of their plan. They have an understanding of the reserve study, they know what's going on, and they're never letting it drift away from them.
Thanks, Kevin. That's fantastic stuff. I want to look at those numbers just a little bit longer. You talked about how to decide when to update and the value of updates. And I think we all know how unsettling it is when an association has a special assessment that, boy, to know that the more frequently you update your reserve study, the fewer special assessments you have, measurably fewer special assessments you have. That's great power to put into the manager and the board of directors' hands.
Yeah, exactly. So if the reserve study basically shows you what major projects are coming up, when they're going to happen, and about how much it's going to cost. So when you have all those facts and details in front of you, there's no reason not to plan accordingly. The only reason to not plan accordingly is if you stick your head in the sand, or you just simply don't know what's coming down the road. So that's what a reserve study is there to help the board with.
Yeah, and if you stick your heads in the sand and pull it up 3 or 5 years down the road, you're going to find yourself in a different place than where you figured you would be.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Kevin. Good stuff. Let me draw this presentation to a close by making sure you know where to go for more information. First, like I introduced at the beginning of the webinar, we have plenty of recorded webinars on our website. And for each of those recorded webinars, I highly recommend looking at the outline, which includes the Q&A from the program. That's a treasure trove of questions that the other attendees have asked, our answers, and you can learn a lot by seeing what other people were thinking, what the other answers were, and that's basically an advanced concepts educational experience all by itself. And of course, there's trade organizations with luncheons and programs pretty much everywhere. And you can learn from those speakers and others in the audience, just people at your table, to help you avoid making mistakes and help you not have to reinvent the wheel at your association. And finally, if you like this program and would like us to do some in-house training for your multi-site management company, by all means shoot us an email. We'd be glad to provide the custom training you need for your staff to be efficient, to be impressive, and confident when presenting reserve study information to your client associations. Clearly, the choices you make create your future. We don't want you to struggle with not knowing the answers, being confronted with, gee, what do I do now? And possibly making unfortunate choices that lead to deterioration, disappointment, and your association looking like Aspen Creek here on the screen, disorganized, sloppy, and mismanaged. We're here. We're one of your subject matter experts that you can reach out to provide the reserve studies that, again, we started out, then matched up with your good choices, creates a great future for your association or the ones that you manage. And like Kevin, let me leave you with one final data point. A strong reserve fund is a smart financial move for your association. We did a study that found, to no surprise, that homes in associations, condominium homes in associations, with a strong reserve fund sold for about 12% more on average than comparable condos in associations with a weak reserve fund. And that just shows that curb appeal is real. Associations that have the money to do their reserve projects on time and do those reserve projects on time enjoy higher property values. And shoot me an email if you want a link to that information. So for more information on reserve studies, the articles we have, the webinars that we've been referencing, or to request a proposal, by all means go to the reservestudy.com website, and there you can scroll down to the bottom and sign up to be in our email list if you want to make sure you get a heads up invitation for future webinars like this one. And that brings us to the close of our program. It's time to turn the microphone over to Paige Showerman, who will handle our Q&A time together. Paige, the microphone is all yours.